Good morning, folks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Not sure where you're connecting from, and it's a pleasure to be here again doing this live. Today we're going to talk about something super controversial. So let's wait for some people to join and maybe interact with me, because I know there are a lot of questions about the learning styles theory, right? And I'm not sure where you stand on the whole debate. What I'm going to try to do here is go over some of my notes. I have a lot of notes from my Psychology of Individual Differences unit at the University of Bristol. I actually wrote blog post about some neuromyths, and then, I'm not sure if you agree with me that the learning styles theory is a neuromyth, but I'll give you some hard evidence to support my claims. And so I'm going to go back and forth and look at different things and hopefully try to do this in a very objective way, because I know that sometimes the jargon, it's very technical, academic language makes it difficult for us teachers to understand, and then we end up not knowing exactly what it means, and then maybe we end up having the wrong ideas of how something works, right? So let's just see if anybody's gonna join me. Okay, English Hook, welcome. Thank you for joining me. I know Saturday morning, not easy. A lot of people went out yesterday. Hope you didn't drink too much. It's hard to get up. And okay, English Hook, yes, good to have you here. I don't have my buddy Rodolfo Machello, but I'm drinking tea, and we're gonna have another edition of Chá Pedagógico on I think it's on the 20th. Let me just check. On the 22nd. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but don't worry, we'll be promoting the whole thing very soon. Okay, so I should get started. Hey John, thank you for joining me as well. Gustavo, thank you guys for joining. Oh, it's 3 o'clock in Ukraine, so we are awake. Good, wonderful. So anyway, if you want to, Mari Bittencourt, thank you very much. So if you want to use the comment section below to maybe tell us what you think about the whole learning styles theory, okay? So do you think that most of it is true? Some of it is true? 10 p.m. in Korea, that's awesome. So we have people from Korea, from Ukraine, some people from Brazil as well. So anyway, so you can use the comment section below to write whether you think that the whole thing is true, some parts of it are true, or none of it is true, learning styles. And to make it easier, let's focus on the most, I'd say the most used model, the VARK model, right? I think you've heard of Walter Burke, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and also reading. So there are many different models, but I think that's the most popular one, especially among English teachers, right? One of the reasons is because of Cambridge, but we'll get into that later. So what do you think? Is it something useful? Is it something that is actually, undermining our students' ability to learn more effectively? Or, we can actually use the whole thing, no questions asked. So maybe you can give your opinion before we get started. All right. Come on, everyone. No need to be ashamed. You can expose yourself a little bit. I can tell you what I used to believe in, and that things have changed quite recently. So it's okay. I think I've used the learning styles theory quite a lot as a teacher back in the day. So when I was really in the classroom, and I think it was very useful. Because, so since nobody's writing anything, okay, John, thank you. I'm not a fan of learning styles. Certainly there are preferences, yes, but I don't like my students to limit themselves. I like that. That's actually a very good comment. So what the literature shows is that learning styles may not be as effective as we had previously believed, and then I'll tell you why. But I think it's useful if we go back to the origin of learning styles, right? So there was in the early 1900s, the first half of last century, definitely useful. I tried to have all VAC during the lesson. Great. Okay, so if you're using all of them, that's actually useful. Great. Anyway, so if you go back to the beginning of last century, when the IQ test got very popular. So Theodore Simon and Alfred Binet, maybe you've heard of them. They were the ones who created the IQ test. So there was an idea that intelligence was something unique, or there was only one aspect, let's say, one side to intelligence, and it had to do with your ability to solve logical problems. So if you've taken an IQ test, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have a bunch of images, and then you have to guess the next pattern or numbers or things like that, right? And then, of course, people who took the test and scored at the lower percentile, they had a very low score. They were considered unintelligent or dumb, to use the right term. And then so people who took the test and scored, I don't know, like 130, 160 points, like, wow, they were considered geniuses, right? Because there was this notion that intelligence is something sort of fixed, and it's something that relates to only one aspect of your cognition, which is, reasoning, most basically that, And then, of course, there was a movement that started in the second half of the last century, the 20th century. Did I say 19th? Actually 20th century, last century. So in the 1950s, 60s, especially in the 70s, you had some psychologists and educators proposing the idea that there were different ways for us to express our intelligence, or even different intelligences, especially with the publication of, our very famous Howard Gardner's Frames of the Mind, right? I think it was in 1983. And he talks about how I think the original book had 7 intelligences rather than just this, reasoning sort of cognitive intelligence. So he talked about visual, spatial, musical, for example, and emotional intelligence. And you might have heard of Daniel Goleman as well. So there was this, I would really like to, I wanted to start with this distinction that there was a movement up till, I don't know, maybe the 50s or 60s, and then something else came along that kind of, went against what was going on. So intelligence is not just one thing, and we have different ways of expressing our intelligence, right? And then what happened in, from the 1980s on, especially in ELT, English language teaching, I think one of the big propagators of this visual, auditory, kinesthetic model was CELTA, Cambridge. So CELTA and Delta. So if you've done the CELTA, you know that there is a point that you have to prepare your lesson, you have to design your lesson plan, thinking about how you're going to cater, or how are you going to address the needs of visual learners and auditory learners and kinesthetic learners, right? And in a way, so that's what happened. In a way that became popular. I'd say that was not necessarily bad at the time, because you started thinking about how to vary or diversify your input as a teacher to make sure that you were addressing the needs of different learners, right? But the thing is, like John put very, very precisely there, maybe their preferences, they are not really styles. So the the question is, do people learn best when they receive input in their style, in their learning style? And then that's a very recent movement that started taking place in the last decade or so. So if you go back to some of the meta-analyses, the systematic reviews of literature, you see that I think there's a, let me try to find the name. There's a very good reference that I forgot the name of the author now. Cofield, yes. So that was in 2004. So, it's kind of recent actually. So you have Cofield, and then you have Waterhouse in 2006, talking about multiple intelligences, and then you have Pasher and Robert Bjork in 2010. So it's kind of recent. What did they do basically? So they started looking for evidence in the scientific literature that you learn best if you your teacher teaches you according to your learning style. And again, we're talking about the visual, auditory, kinesthetic model, right? Last time I checked, there are several models. Accommodator, remember that? Divergent or Diverger, and Converger. So there are many, many different models. So I'm focusing on the one that I think is the most popular, especially for us teachers. So what happened in the last 10 years or so? So we've had evidence for at least 15 years, I think, that you don't actually learn best if you're taught according to your learning style. What does that mean? So I think it's important for me to explain how we conduct experiments like that. A lot of companies, so there's the Learning Styles Inventory by Kolb, one of the guys who actually contributed to the whole theory, and then you have the, I think it was the Learning Styles Network or something, International Learning Styles Network. I think it's learningstyles.net. And you have a lot of companies that sell products or services to assess whether people have this or that learning style, and they have made a lot of money doing that. And nowadays, because of Google, it's very easy for us to find a learning styles test on the internet, and we can very quickly assess our learning style. Questions are kind of very basic, direct. Do you prefer to when you're studying, do you prefer to read a book or your notes, or do you prefer to doodle, or you prefer to, and then they'll give you are predominantly visual or auditory or kinesthetic, right? So there are companies selling those tests. And so what happens? How do scientists conduct the experiments? Well, first they have to assess whether people are visual, auditory, or kinesthetic if they're testing that model. So they will probably use one of the official tests, and then they will basically categorize people into those different groups, And again, this is something that and I'm pretty sure if you are aware of the learning styles, I'm pretty sure you've done the test, you've tested yourself and maybe your students. The test will always give you something that is predominant, right? So you will always have maybe a visual style that is more predominant than auditory. You are never just one thing, but there is one thing that is more predominant. So what does that happen? Why does that happen, right? We'll get into details later. And then the tests are basically, the experiments basically classify people into their different styles. And then they will teach in those styles. So they will get the groups, group A visual, group B auditory, group C kinesthetic, and they will teach them whatever in those styles, according to those styles, and they will check if they were able to learn better because of the way that they were taught. And at the same time, they're going to use methods that are against or that are not really aligned with the group's learning style, and check if that had any influence, any impact on their achievement at the end. So this has been done multiple times in the last 15 years, and the conclusion is you do not learn best if you are taught according to your learning style. Because again, so what's the big deal? It's that we are separating, right? And I think that's very important for us to know, because we're labeling students and ourselves. We're putting ourselves inside a little box that says, I'm a visual learner, more predominantly visual learner. That ends up giving you the false idea that for you to learn better or to learn well, you need to take visual notes. You have to draw schematics, for example, or you need visual aids to learn better. And if you're an auditory learner, if you have done the test and that's what the results point, to I'm an auditory learner, you might be under the impression, which is a false impression according to Robert Bjork, Bachelor, that you don't need to take notes because you can just retrieve everything from memory, from listening. So, so that's going to have an influence on your learning. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to say about the whole, the origins and how we test whether people have a specific learning style or not. But what does that mean for us teachers in terms of our practice in the classroom? And let me take a sip of tea. My cat has just come here, so he'll probably be around. What do you think so far? What questions do you have so far? Yeah? Okay. No questions so far. No problems. I'll just keep going. So what does that mean for us teachers in the classroom? It means that we cannot really teach to a specific learning style. It might be useful. I'm looking, this way because my cat is trying to get somewhere. So it might be useful for us to think that all the students have all the styles. Yeah, Caillou is my cat's name. Yeah, Caillou. That's C-A-I-O. And thank you for asking. Anyway, it might be useful for us as teachers to teach, as if all our students had all the styles, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, okay? On the other hand, I think we should drop the whole learning styles theory and we should look at what we have evidence for that actually supports the things that we're doing in the classroom. So, for example, we know that the brain has a system, and this is also very theoretical, but we can actually, through neuroimaging studies, we can find the locations in our brain where this is taking place, so we have more evidence to support the idea. So we know that our brains have a working memory system, right? And which is essential for learning. So if your working memory is not working, you don't learn new information, basically. Kind of like Dory from Finding Nemo, right? So she has short-term memory loss, and short-term is part of the working memory system, and they are integrated. And if you cannot hold information in your working memory long enough for you to pass it on to the cortex, where it's going to be consolidated as long-term memory, you don't learn. It just fades. So we know how the working memory works. We have a very good theoretical schematic or model for how the working memory works. That was done by Alan Baddeley. He started writing about this in the 70s, and then he went back to his original model in, I think, 2000. And so the idea is that we process information visually and phonologically. So, and then there is another author called Paivio, and he has a text from the 1990s, early 90s, with the concept of dual coding, right? So we know that for anybody to learn, because that's how the brain works, it's not, you have this style or that style. You need to encode information dually. So you need to use visual and auditory input, right? Of course, and then, if you have, I don't know, if you have impaired eyesight or something like that, that you cannot see things, your brain is going to allocate certain areas to, other things, and you can still learn phonologically, right? And it actually increases your power of learning just from phonological input, right? But if you have a typical brain and you don't have any condition regarding your senses, the way that we learn best is by looking at something and by listening at the same time. So the more we have dual coding, so if we are in a lecture and there's a professor speaking at you, just like I'm doing right now, but no visual aids, it might be harder for you to remember that. On the other hand, if there are visual aids and phonological aids, you might be able to retrieve that information more easily in the future because you encoded that in a dual way. That's the whole point, right? And so, yeah, I think somebody's typing something. Oh, no, sorry. So why is maybe the learning styles theory something that we should ditch? I think we have spent a lot of resources on trying to, kind of adapting our materials and many other things, and like award, certification, qualification courses, or whatever you want to call them. We have spent a lot of money. I mean, big accredited institutions have. Cambridge is an example. To propagate ideas that are not really supported by the latest evidence or scientific literature. And we could instead propagate ideas that we have a lot of evidence to support. So instead of saying that, all your students have a predominant learning style, and chances are you're going to have all the learning styles in your classroom, so you have to teach to all learning styles. Instead of saying that, we could say, the brain encodes information in a dual way. So we need phonological and visual and spatial, input for us to encode, to form neural connections and consolidate that memory. And the more associations we have to retrieve that information, the more, or the multiple representations we have of that information in the cortex, the better for your brain to retrieve that. So it's regardless of learning styles. So that's why I don't think we should keep using the whole learning styles thing, because there's a danger there. And then I think people don't really talk about the danger. I think one of the biggest dangers is that on a group level, assuming that everybody will have at least one of the styles, and then you're teaching to all of the styles, that's not so problematic, I suppose. But on an individual level, assuming that somebody has a predominant style and assigning homework according to that style, and assigning tasks and assessing people according to that style, that's problematic. That's dangerous, because you are actually, you are maybe prioritizing the wrong way. Now, like John said a couple of minutes ago, we do have learning preferences. But what research has shown again and again and again is that just because I prefer to learn a certain way, that doesn't mean that that is the best way for me to learn. And if you're interested in watching a wonderful talk by Robert Bjork, B-J-O-R-K, Robert Bjork, I think it's a lecture that he gave. I'm not sure it was Stanford, it was some university in the US. But you can just, Bjork, just Google Bjork, and I can post the link later. I'll just find the link and post later. Bjork and how we learn versus how we think we learn. And a lot of the ideas we have about how we learn are actually wrong according to the scientific evidence. Now, I'm not saying that the scientific evidence is never going to change, because that's not how science works. So in a couple of years, we might have a surprise, we might have a new paradigm, and maybe we're just going to have to go back to the drawing boards and try to figure out how this new thing works, right? But I think we have made a lot of progress, especially in neuroscience, and a lot of the claims that come from psychology, cognitive psychology, they were unsubstantiated. They have been for a very long time just theoretical, because we cannot really test, we cannot really look inside we couldn't, right? Look inside people's brains and see if there is any indication that that theory might work. Now we can. Now we have this power. I mean, it's still making progress, but we have fMRI machines, for example. It's a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and we can see where the blood flows inside the brain, and we can match that to whatever psychology is telling us, and then have a better guess of what might be happening in people's brains. And we need to be very careful when we make such bold claims that people are this, and this is what defines people, and this person is a visual learner, so they need this to learn better. I think we've seen as teachers in many situations that people might be more comfortable with the kind of inputs that they think works best for them, and that kind of gives you the impression that they're learning better. But are they? Have you actually gone back to their test results or whatever? I don't even know. I shouldn't be saying that test results can prove how much they have learned, because I don't believe that all the time. But so are the claims substantiated by what is actually happening in reality? So we have to be careful with that. And I think unless you have questions, I'm going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So what are some of the things that we should keep doing in the classroom as teachers? I think we should assume that everybody has all the learning styles, and we should stop calling it that. I think everything that most things, there are some things that might be wrong or misguided, but the things that were produced because of the learning styles theory, they might be applied, they might be used. So for me, there is a clear sort of division between before we believed as a teaching community that students had different styles, and after. So before, there was this notion that teaching had to be sort of unilateral, it didn't have to be diversified, and it didn't have to be catered or sort of personalized. I think that's the word that I'm looking for. And after the whole learning styles, multiple intelligences theory, I think that influenced us in a positive way, because now as teachers we had to start thinking of ways to reach certain students who may have learned or may be more, have been more prone to learning in a certain way. So, and then what we did basically is we started tapping into how the brain actually works, but we were coming from wrong assumptions, Interesting, the intentions were good, but the assumptions are kind of misguided. So yes, the learning styles theory and the multiple intelligences theory, they are pretty, they have produced good things. They have made us think about the ways that we teach and how we can teach in a way that will affect or will somehow reach most students. However, nowadays we're past that, I think. We are in a time that we have modern technology, regarding, the neuroscientific advancements, and we can use the evidence that has been produced from especially neuroscience to tell us how the brain works, and what we can do to make sure that we are teaching in a more brain-friendly way, So what do we do in the classroom? Keep doing whatever you were doing in a way. So if you think that, I have to consider that I have auditory learners in the classroom. Yeah, you just have to rephrase that in your mind. You have to say, there are no auditory learners. Everybody's auditory. Everybody's visual. Everybody's kinesthetic, I just have to think of how to convey that in a phonological way, because that's how their working memory works. Or I have to think of how to make my students enact that so that they have more representations of the same information in their brains. You don't say, I have to do that because my students are kinesthetic. No, I need to make sure that my students have a lot of representations of the same thing in their brains, because retrieval, getting that information a week from now, a year from now, whatever, will be facilitated if they have multiple ways to get to that information, right? Not because they're kinesthetic or visual or auditory. It's because I have this analogy. It's kind of like going to a camp or camping, like a campsite or something, and in the forest. So if there's only one path that leads you to a specific location where you used to camp with your family, if you don't go back in a couple of years, and maybe the bushes have grown and you cannot find that path, maybe you won't remember how to get to that location because it was in the middle of the forest. However, if you have different paths leading to the same location and you know that they exist, so it's easier for you to get to your goal, which is where you used to camp with your family. So the same thing happens basically in our brains. The more connections we have, the more associations we have, the more representations we have, the easier for our brains to retrieve information, to pull that from the cortex, wherever they are stored, back to our working memory, so we can use that information to do whatever we need to do. So, and then words, I'm going to read some of the words of Howard Gardner himself. So he wrote 2013, it was an interview for the Washington Post, and he says one of the tips that he gives: drop the term styles. It will confuse others and it won't help either you or your students. So, from Howard Gardner himself. And he also said, this is interesting, I should read that. By the middle 1990s, I had noticed a number of misinterpretations of the theory. For example, the confusion of intelligences with learning styles. So Howard Gardner himself, a guy who has definitely contributed to the idea of learning styles, even though he was not the one who created the visual auditory kinesthetic model, he says, and he has said a couple of times, that learning styles are not necessarily the best way to learn. So he says that. So if he says that, an accomplished scientist, maybe we should listen to him. But of course, you can claim, but he was the one who said back in the day, in the 1980s, that this is how our intelligences, like he says, worked. Well, science moves on. I think that's the message for you. And if you want to ask any question now, yes, English Hook, could you please recommend any books to read on this topic? I'm not sure. I think there's one book. I'd recommend two books. So there's a book by Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, 2014. It's 50 applications or 50 classroom applications of the mind, brain, and education science. It's a big book. And there's another one, Introduction to Neuroeducational research by my wonderful professor Paul Howard Jones. Okay, so and then of course he has another book, the Evolution of the Learning Brain, or How You Got to Be So Smart. So Paul Howard Jones, that was launched last year. Okay. Anyway, I hope this was useful. I hope you're not feeling so uncomfortable now because, I'm not telling you to drop everything you've ever done. The learning styles theory may actually have helped you become a better teacher because you have diversified the way you teach, and then you did everything that I told you. Dual coding, multiple representations of the same piece of information in the brain, tackling the phonological and the visual spatial sketchpad channels of your working memory. So you're doing all of that. But learning styles, they're not really, we should drop the term. Let's stop using the term. It will take a while, but a lot of people are making a lot of money on those things, and we shouldn't be spending money, especially research money on stuff that has, been kind of, I don't like to say debunked, but, has been kind of put aside because new evidence has come out, right? That's it. Yeah. So if you liked it, follow me on Instagram, share with your friends, tag me. I will download this and upload to YouTube and probably, definitely actually, IGTV in a couple of days. Okay. So thank you very much. No other questions? Nope. I think that's it. 8822. Thank you for joining us. Jussara too. Yes. I think Camila. Thank you. I hope you had fun. And if you have any questions, you know where to find me. And of course, you can always check my blog. So I have a blog series about neuromyths. So you just go to edcrocks.com and you write neuromyths. And I think I have a 4 or 3 blog post series about some of the most common neuromyths. And I talk about learning styles. Okay? So have a wonderful Saturday, a wonderful Sunday, everyone. Bye-bye.